In this video, you're going to learn how to improve your Mongoose models. This is going to let you add things like validation, you can make certain properties required, and you can set up smart defaults. So if something like completed is not provided, you can have a default value that gets set. All of this functionality is built into Mongoose. We just have to learn how to use it. And to illustrate why we'd want to set this stuff up, let's scroll to the bottom of our server file and remove all of the properties on the new to-do we create. Then we're going to save the file and move into the terminal running the script. That's going to be node in the server directory, and the file is called server.js. When we run it, what do we get? We get our new to-do, but it only has the version and ID properties. All of the properties we specified in the model, text, completed, and completed at, they're nowhere to be found, and that's a pretty big problem. We should not be adding to-dos to the database if they don't have a text property, and things like completed should have smart defaults. No one's going to create a to-do item if they already completed it, so completed should default to false. Now, in order to get started, we're going to pull up 2 pages in the Mongoose documentation, just so you know where this stuff lives if you ever want to dive deeper in the future. First up, we're going to look up the validators. I'm going to Google Mongoose validators. And this is going to show us all of the default validation properties we have built in. For example, we can set something as required. So if it's not provided, it's going to throw an error when we try to save that model. We can also set up validators for things like numbers and strings, giving a min max value or a min length max length value for a string. The other page we're going to look at is the schemas page. To get to this, we're going to Google Mongoose schemas. This is the first one, the guide.html file, and on this page, you're going to see something slightly different from what we've been doing so far. Right here, they call new schema, setting up all of their properties. This is not something we've done yet, but we will in the future. For now, you can consider this object, the schema object, identical to the one we have over in Atom that we pass in as the second argument to our Mongoose model call. To kick things off, let's customize how Mongoose treats our text property. Currently, we tell Mongoose that we want it to be a string, but we don't have any validators. One of the first things we can do for the text property is set required equal to true. When you set required equal to true, the value must exist. So if I were to try to save this to do, it would fail, and we can prove this. We can save the file, head over to the terminal, shut things down, restart it, and what do we get? We get an unreadable error message. We'll dive into this in a second, but for now, all you need to know is that we're getting a validation error. To do validation failed, and that is fantastic. Now, aside from just making sure the text property exists, we can also set up some custom validators. For strings, for example, we have a min length validator. And this is fantastic. You shouldn't be able to create a to-do whose text is an empty string like this one. We can set min length equal to the minimum length, which we're going to set as 1 in this case. Now, even if we do provide a text property down below, let's say we set text equal to an empty string, it's still going to fail. It is indeed there, but it does not pass this validator where the min length must be 1. I can save the server file, restart things over in the terminal, and we still get a failure. Now, aside from required and min length, there are a couple other utilities that are around in the docs. One good example is something called trim. Trim is fantastic for strings. Essentially, trim trims off any white space in the beginning or end of your value. If I set trim equal to true, it's going to remove any leading or trailing white space. So if I try to create a to-do whose text property is just a bunch of spaces, it's still going to fail. The trim property is going to remove all of the leading and trailing spaces, leaving an empty string. And if I rerun things, we still get a failure. The text field is invalid. Now, if we do provide a valid value, things are going to work as expected. Right in the middle of all of these spaces, I'm going to provide a real to-do value. Edit this video. When we try to save this to do, what's going to happen is first up, the spaces in the beginning and the end of the string, those are going to get trimmed. Then it's going to validate that this string has a minimum length of 1, which it does. And finally, it will save the to-do to the database. I'm going to go ahead and save server.js, restart our script, and this time around, we get our to-do. Edit this video shows up as the text property. Those leading and trailing spaces have been removed. And this is fantastic. Using just 3 properties, we were able to configure our text property, setting up some validation. Now we can do similar stuff for completed. For completed, we're not going to require it because the completed value is most likely going to default to false. So what we can do instead is set the default property, giving this completed field a default value. Now completed, as we talked about earlier in the video, should default to false. There's no reason to create a to-do if it's already done. We can do the same thing for completed at. If a to-do starts off not completed, then completed at is not going to exist. Completed at is only going to exist when the to-do has been completed. It's going to be that timestamp. So what I'm going to do is set default equal to null. Awesome. Now with this in place, we have a pretty good schema for our to-do. We're going to validate that the text is set up properly by the user, and we are going to set up these values by ourselves since we can just use defaults. With this in place, I can now rerun our server file. And here we get a better default to do. We have the text the user provided. It's been validated and trimmed. Down below, we have completed set to false and completed at set to null. And this is fantastic. We now have a foolproof schema that has good defaults and validation. Now, if you've been playing around with the various types, you might have noticed that if you set a type equal to something other than the type you specified, in certain cases it does still work. For example, down below, if I try to set text equal to an object, I'm going to get an error. It's going to say, hey, you tried to use a string, but an object showed up instead. But if I try to set text equal to something like a number, I'm going to go with 23, this is going to work. That's because Mongoose is going to cast your number into a string, essentially wrapping it in quotes. The same thing is going to be true with a Boolean. If I pass in a Boolean like this, the resulting string is going to be the one I have right here. I'm going to go ahead and save the file after setting text equal to true and run the script. When I do it, what do I get? I get text equal to true right here. Notice it is indeed wrapped in quotes. It's important to be aware that typecasting does exist inside of Mongoose. It can easily trip you up and cause some unexpected errors. For now, though, I am going to set text back equal to a proper string. Now it's time for a challenge where you are going to be responsible for creating a brand new Mongoose model. Down below, I'll leave a few comments describing what I'd like you to do. First up, you're going to make a new user model. Eventually, we're going to use this for authentication. It's going to store stuff like an email, a password, and the to-dos are going to be associated with the user. So when I create one, only I can edit it. Now that's all going to happen later. For now, we're going to keep things really simple. On the user, the only property you need to set up is the email property. We'll set up others like password later, but it's going to be done a little differently since it needs to be secure. So for now, we'll just stick with email. I do want you to require it. I also want you to trim it. So if someone adds spaces before or after, those spaces go away. Last but not least, go ahead and set the type equal to a string, set type, and set min length of 1. Now, obviously, you'll be able to pass in a string that's not an email. We'll explore custom validation a little later. This is going to let us validate that the email is an email, but for now, this is going to get us on the right track. Once you have your Mongoose model created, I want you to go ahead and try to create a new user. Create one without the email property and then make one with one, making sure that when you run the script, the data shows up as expected over in RoboMongo. And this data should show up in the new users collection. Take a moment to create the model, save a user, and check it out in the database. Pause the video, and when you're done, go ahead and click play. I hope that wasn't too much trouble. The first thing I'm going to do is make a variable to store this new model. A variable called uppercase U user, and I'm going to set that equal to mongoose.model, which is how we can make our new user model. The first argument, as you know, needs to be the string model name. I'm going to use the exact same name as I specified over in the variable, although it could be different. I just like to keep things using this pattern, where the variable equals the model name. Next up, as the second argument, we can specify the object where we configure all of the properties a user should have. Now, as I mentioned, we'll be adding others later, but for now, adding support for an email property will be good enough. And there's a few things I want to do on this email. First up, I want to set the type. An email is always going to be a string, so we can set that type equal to string. Next up, we're going to require it. You can't make a user without an email, so I'll set required equal to true. After required, we're going to go ahead and trim that email. If someone adds spaces before or after it, it's clearly a mistake, so we'll go ahead and remove those for the user, making our application just a little more user-friendly. Last but not least, what we want to do is set up a min length. We'll be setting up custom validation later, but for now, a min length of 1 is going to get the trick done. Now I am going to go ahead and create a new instance of this user and save it. Before I run the script though, I will be commenting out our new to-do. I actually have 2 to-dos commented out now, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the first one, leaving the second one. There's no need to have 2 examples of the same thing. And now down below, we can make a new instance of this user model. I'm going to make a variable called user and set it equal to new user, passing in any values we want to set on that user. Now I'm going to run it with nothing at first just to make sure the validation is working. Down below, I can now call user.save. Save returns a promise, so I can tack on a then callback. I'm going to add a success case for this one and an error handler. The error handler will get that error argument, and the success case will get the doc. If things go well, I'll print a message using console.log, user saved, followed by the doc. No need to format it for this example, and I'll do the same thing down below. Console.log, unable to save user, followed by the error object. Now, since we're creating a user with no properties, we would expect the error to print. I'm going to save server.js, restart the file, and what do we get? We get our error. It's a validation error. Path email is required. Mongoose is letting us know that we do indeed have an error. The email does need to exist since we set required equal to true. I'm going to go ahead and put a value in here, setting email to my email, andrew@example.com, and I'll put a few spaces afterwards. This time around, things should go as expected, and trim should be trimming the end of that email, removing all of the spaces. And that's exactly what we get. The user was indeed saved, which is great, and the email has been properly formatted. Now, obviously, I could have put a string in like 1, 2, 3, and it would have worked because we don't have custom validation set up just yet, but we have a pretty good starting point. We have the user model, and we have our email prop set up and ready to go. With this in place, we are now going to start creating that API. In the next video, you're going to install a tool called Postman, which is going to help us test our HTTP requests. Then, right after that one, which will be a quick one, we're going to create our very first route for our to-do REST API.